Are you going gray? So why do we go gray? Well, there's this recent study that suggests that going gray might actually be a mechanism that we have developed to protect us from developing cancer. So Asterix, this is a study in mice, but a very interesting study where they've understood the biology of what we call melanocyte precursor cells. Those are cells that make melanocytes, and melanocytes in turn are the cells that make our melanin, which is the color we have in our skin, our eyes, and our hair. So when melanocyte precursor cells go dormant, or what's called senescent, or basically when they age out, they stop making melanocytes, we lose the melanin, and our hair goes gray. That happens with age, but it can also happen with certain stressors like chemotherapy or ionizing radiation that you might get for cancer. On the other hand, there are other exposures like UVB radiation from the sun or certain carcinogens that can turn those melanocyte precursor cells very active and make them reproduce excessively and actually form a cancer, a type of cancer called melanoma. So these researchers found that two different types of exposures had very much opposite effects on these melanocyte precursor cells. If you had ionizing radiation or chemotherapy exposure, for example, which kind of simulates the aging process, you would have what's called a double-stranded DNA break. So both strands of the DNA in those cells would break, the cell would go dormant, the hair would go gray. On the other hand, if you expose that same cell to UVB radiation or to certain types of carcinogens, the cell would become hyperactive and form tumors. Then they took those cells and they exposed them to these same things sequentially to try to simulate what happens with aging. So first they took the cells and made them senescent or dormant, which sort of simulates the aging process, and then they exposed them to those same carcinogens. And what they found was that if the cells were dormant, in other words, if the hair was gray already, they were less susceptible to becoming cancerous. And their conclusion was that it's possible that this process of cell death or senescence that our melanocyte precursor cells undergo with age actually protects them from becoming cancerous later on in life. The reason being that we are exposed to all sorts of carcinogens throughout our lives and have all sorts of mutations in our DNA. And at some point, the cell says, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice myself and undergo a double-stranded DNA break to prevent myself from becoming a cancer cell. And this may be an evolutionary response that we've developed to protect us from cancer later in life. So going gray may not be all bad. Happy New Year.